Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Ryan Galloway, and I'm going to give you a lecture on how to answer critiques. So I'm going to begin by introducing the components of a critique, because in order to answer something, you have to know what it is you're answering, and then give you a rubric for answering critiques. And then in my next lecture, I will discuss how to answer critiques specific to the criminal justice topic. So let's begin. Critique was an argument created in 1991 by the University of Texas at the opening tournament called the University of Northern Iowa at that moment in time. Now, there were arguments like critiques run before that, but it's the first time the idea of the critique itself was introduced in debate. And critique comes from the German meaning to criticize, which is why it's spelled with a K as opposed to the Critique critique version. And it is an argument that challenges the philosophical or linguistic assumptions of the affirmative case. So either the underpinnings of the affirmative case or potentially the way language is used in the affirmative case. So the example I give is, why would it be wrong to say mankind when referring to human beings? And the reason why it would be wrong is that because it would exclude everyone who doesn't identify as a man who is a human being. And so a lot of the world is excluded, a lot of human beings are excluded when we say mankind to refer to human beings. The philosophical assumption is that we're only referring to people who identify as men. The linguistic assumption is that we specify only those who identify as men when we say mankind. Critiques usually start with an implicit framework debate regarding what the debate is about. Now, I say implicit because usually when the critique is introduced in the 1NC, there's not something labeled framework and then they tell you what it is. You have to look to what the argument is to understand what they're trying to say the debate should be about. And critiques often say the debate is not about a utilitarian framework. It's not about a cost-benefit analysis of the plan. The negative will usually argue it's about something else. It could be about the scholarship that you use, and they could argue that we're just scholars studying this. We don't have the ability to put a plan into action, and therefore you should look at the scholarship that we use. Or we all use language, not only in the debate, but language in the real world. So the debate could be about how to best use language. And if the critique wins that the linguistic assumptions of the affirmative are bad, then we shouldn't utilize the affirmative and you should vote negative to reject the affirmative. Critiques, just like disads, have links. The difference is the link isn't always to the plan. It could be to an advantage, it could be to rhetoric you use, it could be to a card that you use, etc. So any language or assumption made in your evidence could be a link to the critique. So example, if you justify maintaining the prison system, you link to the abolition critique. And I'm going to foreshadow a little bit of part 2 of this lecture that probably the number one critique on this topic is that we ought to abolish either the prison system or the criminal justice system as a whole. And if your affirmative justifies the prison system, then you should be rejected because we ought to rethink whether or not we should be using prisons at all. And we ought to be, instead of using prisons, we ought to be funding community alternatives that help solve crime, that help solve poverty, that help solve the root causes of crime, etc. So instead of focusing on punishment, we ought to be focusing on prevention in the first place. Just like disads, critiques have impacts. Unlike disads, critiques often have deontological impacts, or something you should reject no matter what. So deontology is usually contrasted with utilitarianism. Deontology argues that there are certain things that you should not do no matter what the circumstances are. And the example you're probably most familiar with is the Ten Commandments in the Bible. It says, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, etc. It doesn't say, thou shalt not kill unless you need to save 5 people by doing so. It doesn't say, thou shalt not steal, unless your grandmother needs money for heart surgery. It creates an absolute rule, one that we should always follow. And a lot of critiques will say that the impact is such that if you violate the impact, that you should be voted against no matter what. That capitalism is unethical, that racism should be voted against no matter what, etc. But there's an absolute moral rule challenging the affirmative. Critiques also often have systemic impacts, meaning the continuation of a system that causes oppression, or even one that makes extinction inevitable. And you're probably familiar with the capitalism critique, and it would argue that capitalism is an unethical system, and we need to challenge the system of capitalism. Otherwise, we continue to live in an unethical world. That capitalism is the root cause of oppression, that either it's the root cause of racism, sexism, patriarchy, etc., and that capitalism is the root cause of environmental destruction. That until we get rid of the profit motive, that people will have incentives to cut down forests, to kill ecosystems, etc., in order to make a profit. Critiques usually have an alternative. They don't always have an alternative, but they usually do. And the best way to think about the critique alternative is to think of it like a counterplan. So the negative will argue for an alternative system to the affirmative. Unlike a counterplan, it may not be a system that's put into place by the federal government or by a government at all. It could be individuals need to rethink their role in an oppressive system. So an alternative is often to withdraw from an oppressive system or to rethink the oppressive structure. And an alternative to the abolition critique could either be that we need to abolish prisons, or what I think is a better alternative is individuals need to rethink whether or not we should have prisons in the first place. And it's the logic, it's the methodology of thinking that you need a prison that locks us into that system of oppression in the first place. And we need to think outside the box. What would the world look like if we didn't have prisons in it? So a critique example, the affirmative's focus on innocence justifies using the criminal justice system. You say that people shouldn't be punished because they're innocent, which suggests that if you were guilty, that you should be punished in the first place. And the impact is the prison industrial complex causes racism and dehumanization. I don't want to go through the full specifics right now, but certainly there are a lot of African American and Latino people in prison. There are authors that argue that it's the continuation of the system of slavery that we keep so many African Americans in prison, that we started with slavery, we continued with Jim Crow laws, and the modern day version of those things is the prison industrial complex, where we keep a lot of African Americans, especially African Americans, behind bars, and it prevents them from achieving justice in the United States. And the alternative would be the judge should rethink the logic of the prison system. Now that we have an example of a critique, we can talk about how to answer the critique. And I think the rubric you should use is the rubric of STOP: solvency, theory, offense, and permutations. You want to start with solvency, that the alternative doesn't solve the case. Then you want to defend your framework. And then you want offense, that proves either why your affirmative is a good idea or their theory is a bad one. And then you want to combine the affirmative and the alternative. The primary way to beat the critique is to prove the alternative doesn't solve the case, and then win that the case outweighs. You need to get your case back in the game. After all, you spent 8 minutes reading your case. One would hope that you would want to get all of those advantages, or at least a good portion of them, back in the debate. You could argue you should assess what should pragmatically be done, that while it's nice to think theoretically about what should be done, we need to think what can pragmatically be done in the United States today, and to not make the perfect the enemy of the good. You should also argue for specificity to prove that the alternative won't solve the specifics of the case. And I think this is especially true if you're debating an alternative like withdrawing from capitalism. What does capitalism have to do with the death penalty? How does challenging capitalism mean that we should go ahead and inject someone with a lethal injection and kill them? Make them be specific in explaining how those things function. Why does challenging the prison system, what does it have to do with the advantages of the AF? If you're running the death penalty affirmative, challenging the prison system doesn't mean that you shouldn't kill someone. If we're killing someone, that might be worse than putting them into prison, and therefore challenging the prison system doesn't have anything to do with challenging the mechanics of actually killing someone. Framework is usually the number one theory argument, or T in the stop, that you want to emphasize. You can argue that the debate should only be about policy because of affirmative choice, that the affirmative should get to pick whether or not the plan is a policy plan or a critique-oriented plan, and that makes debaters more flexible. You can also say the resolution is a policy resolution. It's framed around a question of policy. It asks, what should we do about something? And it doesn't ask whether or not we should rethink that thing. You can also argue for fairness, that there's an infinite number of philosophies and discursive arguments. The philosophy section of any library is very large, and it's a very difficult affirmative burden to say they should be prepared to answer any philosophical point of view, no matter how obscure, when running their affirmative. And then you want to argue that you should weigh your affirmative. You should get to weigh your affirmative. Usually, what you're trying to do with the framework argument is not to win that the judge should either reject critiques in general or reject this specific critique, but merely to try and get your case back in the game. The negative has a lot of critique dirty tricks they can use to try and make sure you don't get to weigh your affirmative at all. And you want to make sure that you get the opportunity to weigh your affirmative. Vague alternatives can also get you somewhere, usually as a solvency deficit to the critique. You can argue that the alternative is vague, that social activists won't know what to rally around, that they won't know what to challenge, and therefore the critique's alternative would fail. Usually you could initiate this as, in the 2AC, as a vague alternative is either a reason to reject the critique or a reason why the critique won't solve, and then in the 1AR and 2AR collapse down to the vagueness of the alternative means social movements won't know what to rally around, they won't rally around the correct things, and the movement will become corrupted from within. You also want to ask in the cross-examination, is the alternative inconsistent with the AF? And see what they have to say, because you can begin to set up the permutation of doing the alternative if the alternative isn't inconsistent with the AF. So for example, against the prison abolition critique, if you're affirmative in banning the death penalty, you want to ask the question, can the alternative ever ban the death penalty? And you want to follow up and make sure you get a straight answer to this question, because lots of times people will be very vague about their answer to this question. They'll be like, well, it could, or it would, but not the way you do it, because they don't want to have to debate you on the question of whether or not it's good to kill people or not. You can place the emphasis on what your affirmative does, and if they don't solve the affirmative, then you get your affirmative back in the game. Or if they say, oh yes, we could result in banning the death penalty, it sets up the permutation that you can go ahead and do the alternative, because the alternative is not inconsistent with the AF. The best way to generate offense is to indict the theory. You can argue that the prison system is a necessary evil, or your plan solves oppression. You could argue that getting rid of the prison system means we don't have a solution to the truly violent people in the world. That yes, there are some people that don't need to be put in prison. There are people we put in prison right now for minor offenses who don't need to be there, but that you ultimately need some level of a prison system in order to deal with the worst of the worst. Or you could just argue that your plan solves oppression. I think you're in good stead on this topic to claim affirmatives that take a step in the direction of solving racism or take a step in the direction of solving abuse of people. And therefore, you can argue that your plan does something good, especially if you can argue that the alternative will fail. You can also use author arguments at this point in time. Many of you probably already have or should have a huge critique back file of answers to particular authors. But you'll definitely want some answers to specific authors on this topic. Angela Davis writes about the prison abolition movement, and you would want some cards against her. Wilderson writes about Afro-pessimism, and he's just written a new book called Afro-pessimism, so you definitely want some author indictments in that situation. You may want some author indictments of the various CLS authors like Unger and Tushnet, and you may also want to argue against Foucault, who people would argue is another kind of critique on this topic. But you want to make sure you have answers to those authors and argue that their theories are flawed. Finally, you always want to permute a critique. It is probably the most powerful answer to the critique. You want to argue, do both, and do the plan and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative. And what is the difference between those two things? Do both is just do the plan and do the alternative. Now, sometimes critique teams will put in extra parts of the alternative that seem like they're inconsistent with the plan. So sometimes an alternative is pretty vague and it's just the alternative is to vote negative. Well, when you argue for all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative, you're arguing for do the plan and all the parts of that alternative that are implicit that don't necessarily disagree with the affirmative. So you wouldn't do the affirmative and vote negative. You would instead do the affirmative and all other parts of the alternative that don't directly reject the affirmative. And I think that's especially true with things like the death penalty affirmative. If the alternative can do the plan, then do the alternative also works. So when you fish out in your first cross-examination of the critique whether or not the affirmative can do the alternative, you want to say that the alternative is not inconsistent with the plan. If the alternative can result in the plan, it's not inconsistent with the plan. So here's an example of what your critique frontline could look like. The critique doesn't solve the case. The critique doesn't solve for killing the innocent. The critique doesn't solve for our international advantages to banning the death penalty. So even if the abolition critique got rid of prisons, it wouldn't put us in line with banning the death penalty with other nations that have banned the death penalty. Then you can argue the debate should be about, is the plan better than a policy alternative or the status quo? You can argue for AF choice. You can argue the resolution is a policy resolution, and the implication is to reject the critique or allow us to weigh our affirmative. And I almost always think you want to argue for middle grounds on these theory arguments. I think it's pretty unlikely that most judges would reject a critique out of hand. I think there are very few judges left that are so antithetical to critiques that they would not vote on one. But there are judges who are sympathetic with the affirmative, that the affirmative ought to get to weigh their affirmative against the critique. So I think this is true of all theory arguments, but you want to argue for a middle ground. Then you could attack the alternative, that the prison system is a necessary evil for truly dangerous criminals, that someone who has committed truly violent acts shouldn't be let out of prison and let out to do those kinds of crimes again. Then you want to argue to do the plan and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative and permute to do both. So what I've gone over today is I've given you an introduction to the basics of critiques. I've given you a rubric to help you answer critiques, and our rubric is STOP: solvency deficit, theory, offense, and permutations. And that rubric can help you against just about any kind of critique.